Civilizations have, for millennia, decided where to build cities and develop trade routes based on the course of natural rivers and waterways. And today, canals and waterways are a vital part of global trade. So join me for today's video. We're going to take a look at the top 15 most incredible canals and waterways. Number 15. The Grachtengordel, Amsterdam, Netherlands. Amsterdam attracts visitors from around the world for a number of different reasons, one of which is the stunning canal district that locally is known as the Grachtengordel. Found in the center of the city, there are four main canals: the Singel, the Herengracht, the Keizersgracht, and the Prinsengracht, all of which run almost in parallel to each other and lead to the Amstel River. In all, however, the city has around 62 miles of canals that form concentric belts, making it one of the most developed canal cities in the world. They were constructed in the Dutch Golden Era during the 17th century and are lined with various different support buildings that, because they were built at different times during the city's history, display a range of different architectural styles. The whole point of putting the canals there was to revitalize the local economy following a turbulent period of war, and they're seen as such a great example of town planning and design that the district was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2010. As well as seeing the waterways themselves, there are many small historic bridges that cross them, and a number of museums and sites of interest in the local area, the most famous of which is the Anne Frank House that's alongside the Prinsengracht Canal. Number 14. Khlong Saep, Bangkok, Thailand. Located in central Thailand and connecting the Praya River to two of the country's eastern provinces, the Khlong Saep is a 45-mile canal that passes through Bangkok. It was commissioned by King Rama III, and it was completed in 1840 after 3 years of construction, soon becoming an important transport route in the region. Along its length, it crosses 21 districts and connects a wider network of more than 100 canals. But what it's probably most famous for is the express boat services that run in the capital city, that are not only a faster transport alternative to any other options, but gives a unique perspective of the neighborhoods that line its banks. Originally, it was also used for decorative purposes too, and would be filled with thousands of lotus plants. Unfortunately, residents and businesses of Bangkok saw it as a cheap and easy way to dispose of waste materials, and until very recently, the water in the canal was dangerously polluted. The cleanup project that began in 2017 has now undone a lot of this, though, and the canal is slowly returning to its former glory. It's hoped that by clamping down on the illegal disposal of polluted wastewater into it, we'll see conditions continue to improve in the coming years, and it will regain its place as one of the most scenic waterways in Asia. Number 13. Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal, Chicago, Illinois, United States. We often think of canals as being for transport purposes, but the Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal was mainly commissioned in the late 1800s to help deal with the spiraling sewage management issues in the city. Stretching 28 miles between the Chicago River and the Des Plaines River, it opened in 1900 and caused the flow of water to reverse along the south branch of the Chicago River. So instead of flowing into Lake Michigan, it flows out of it. This prevented the lake from being polluted by wastewater, so it could remain a source of drinking water and give it a chance to be filtered and cleaned before releasing it into the Des Plaines River. At 202 feet wide and 24 feet deep, it also created a passage that could handle much larger ships than were able to use the much smaller Illinois and Michigan Canal that they had to rely on before. It soon became a vital transport link in the region and even had a much bigger influence, as it acted as a training project for the engineers who would later go on to build the Panama Canal. Today, it's recognized on the National Register of Historic Places, and while it's not relied on for transport as much as in its heyday, it's still a hugely important waterway. There have been, though, attempts to completely close it in recent years because of the presence of Asian carp and invasive species, with fears that its connection to the lakes and the wider river system could facilitate their spread to places they haven't yet reached. Number 12. Llangollen Canal, England, Wales, UK. The 46-mile Llangollen Canal begins in Hurlston, which is in Cheshire in England, and covers a route that connects the town in the Welsh county of Devonshire. The first plans for a series of waterways in the region were proposed by two industrialists in the late 18th century, and the initial part of the project opened in 1795. It would be another 10 years before it was joined up with the rest of the canal network, though, and even when the different sections were known under different names until the 1980s, when it was given the name it's now known as today. Originally, it was an extremely important trade route to transport iron and coal from Wales to England. But when the industry began to decline, the canals were only kept in order to act as a water bridge between other routes on the network. Following the Second World War, however, boats began using it again for leisure cruises, and its popularity began to increase thanks to its picturesque setting, the traditional design of the 21 locks that lie along it, and the 126-foot-long aqueduct that crosses the River Dee, and that's the largest of its kind in the UK. With tunnels passing through hills and also a route that takes it across the Fens, Wicksall, and Beddisfield Mosses National Nature Reserve, this is one of the most beautiful boating routes you can ever journey across. Number 11. Canal du Midi, France. Originally opened in 1681, the Canal du Midi in southern France connects the Garonne River to the Mediterranean, and in conjunction with the Canal de Garonne join the Med to the Atlantic through the country. It's seen as one of the greatest engineering projects of the 17th century, and along its 150-mile route it had 86 locks, although only 65 of these are still in use. To allow the canal to cross rivers without affecting the water flow, 6 aqueducts were built, the most impressive of which is the Orbe Aqueduct. That's a 790-foot-long bridge over the Orbe River in the city of Béziers. In a similar way to how railroads have transformed industry around the world and brought wealth to communities along the routes, the same happened with the Canal du Midi when it opened. The main driving force behind it was its ability to transport wheat from fertile farmlands to the regions in need of more food. Ports were soon built along the canal that became trade hubs for a wide variety of goods. Despite being one of the oldest canals in Europe that's still in operation, it has an impressive depth of between 5.9 and 6.6 feet and averages around 66 feet wide across its entirety. Of course, in modern times, it's less relied upon by industry and has instead become an important leisure waterway, supporting water sports and boaters, as well as providing water for agriculture during the dry season. It's also seen as a great example of France's engineering and structural heritage, so it's not only been granted protected status by the French government as a Grand Site of France, but was also inscribed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1996. Number 10. Corinth Canal, Greece. There had been plans as far back as the time of the ancient Greeks to carve a route through the Isthmus of Corinth, a narrow piece of land that separates the Gulf of Corinth in the Ionian Sea from the Saronic Gulf in the Aegean Sea. And even though there had been attempts to start constructing it many centuries ago, the Corinth Canal was only finally completed in 1893. Interestingly, once it was finished, it essentially turned the Peloponnesian Peninsula into an island because it no longer had land connection with the mainland, but ultimately, all of the effort was in vain. The canal is 4 miles long and just about 87 feet wide, which is far too narrow for most modern ships. Add to this difficulty to navigate the waterway and the regular closures that were needed because of landslides on its steep limestone walls, and it soon became clear that this wasn't a viable, reliable route for the transport of goods like had been hoped. It saves what would otherwise be a 430-mile journey around the peninsula, but this potential benefit isn't seen as worth the risk of a ship becoming stuck in the canal. It is, however, a beautiful stretch of water, and the connection of these two seas has made a popular route for tourist boats. When it's opened, around 11,000 ships travel through each year and gives passengers the opportunity to capture astonishing pictures as they cross what looks like a naturally formed route. Number 9. Rideau Canal, Ontario, Canada. The 126-mile-long Rideau Canal is an artificial waterway that was first opened in 1832 to connect Ottawa, the capital city of Canada, with Lake Ontario. Its name, when translated from French, means curtain, after the appearance of the waterfalls where the Rideau River meets the Ottawa River. It's the oldest canal system that's been in continual operation in North America, but unusually, it wasn't originally conceived as a trade route. At the time, there was real concern that the United States was planning to follow the St. Lawrence River to launch an invasion of Upper Canada, which was a British colony, and the Rideau Canal was part of a strategy that would provide an easily traversable route between Montreal and the main naval base at Kingston, Ontario. Of course, the invasion never happened, and the canal was ultimately never needed for defensive purposes, but it soon became vital for commercial use and played an important role in Canada's early development by facilitating shipping, trade, and the movement of tens of thousands of immigrants to new communities. As is the case with most other canals, the arrival of the railroad virtually ended the industrial reliance on this canal because transport by train was so much faster and more reliable. But the invention of the outboard motor has meant that this is now one of the most popular recreational waterways in the country. It's now part of the Great Loop, which is a system of interconnected waterways across the eastern US and Canada. It means you can travel by pleasure craft from Ottawa to as far as Chicago, Mississippi, or even Florida. Number 8. Can Tho, Vietnam. Built in the Mekong River Delta region in Vietnam, Can Tho is the country's fourth largest city. But this isn't your typical city. It's actually on the banks of a tributary of the Mekong River called the Hao River, and a large portion of it either floats on water or is connected by canals. The canal network in Can Tho was first built to allow traders to bring their boats much closer to the businesses they wanted to sell to, rather than having to unload at a port. This idea helped the city to thrive and become what's seen as the western capital of the country. The increased reliance on using the river for transport meant that huge floating markets began to develop, and even these are unusual in they're made up of a number of permanent structures, but also give the opportunity for sellers to moor their boats and sell their produce for a day before motoring home again. What initially began as an idea for commerce has now been evolved into a hugely popular tourist destination, with people traveling from across the globe to see the floating markets and the intricate rural canal network. From the water, you can also get an incredible view of the historical and modern structures that line the river and canal banks, including the world-renowned Can Tho Bridge. Number 7. Grand Canal, Venice, Italy. When you think of canals from around the world, there's probably none more famous than the Grand Canal, which is the main waterway through Venice in Italy. At 2.4 miles long, it takes on an S shape as it passes between the lagoon near the Santa Lucia railway station and the basin near San Marco. It varies between 98 and 295 feet wide, and it has an average depth of around 16 feet. Meaning it's one of the most easily navigable canals in Venice. What stands out as most unusual about this canal, though, is its curved shape. Normally, artificial waterways like this are built to be straight, so they're easy to travel along, and the majority of the canals in Venice that connect to the Grand Canal are straight too. This had led researchers to believe that the Grand Canal actually follows the route of a small river that has, as the city began to increase in size, needed to be expanded as well. It's quite possible that this act of turning a river into an artificially widened canal was what taught local engineers about canal building, and is the reason why Venice is the place that it is today. Alongside the Grand Canal are more than 170 different buildings, most of which were built between the 13th and 18th centuries, and show not only the changing architectural styles, but the lavish designs that were funded by the noble Venetian families as a very public display of their wealth. Surprisingly, throughout history, the vast majority of traffic in Venice went along the canal as opposed to across it, so for a long time the Rialto Bridge was the only way to cross it without using a boat. This has now changed with the addition of 3 further bridges, but this still highlights how important the canal is to the city and why it can at times feel like a city that's split into halves. Number 6. Alappuzha, Kerala, India. Located in the Indian state of Kerala, Alappuzha is a district that's one of the country's most popular tourist destinations. One of the reasons for this is the vast network of brackish lagoons, canals, and interconnected lakes and rivers that are collectively known as the Kerala backwaters, and led to Alappuzha becoming known as the Venice of the East. In all, there's around 560 miles of waterways, which cover around half of the area of the state of Kerala, including 5 large lakes, 38 rivers, and a series of man-made and natural canals. There are countless communities dotted around the region that rely on the backwaters, whether it be to fish, grow crops, or take advantage of the large number of tourists that visit by offering cruises, ferry services, and the chance to live on the waterways in a houseboat. With such a vast number of canals, it wasn't a purposefully designed network and is instead the result of numerous small projects that connect the rivers and lakes that have been combined to form something truly spectacular. One of the unexpected effects has been how it's radically altered the local ecosystem by mixing the fresh water of the rivers with the salt water of the Arabian Sea, and this has enabled many different species of animals and plants to thrive. On a tour through the backwaters, you could expect to see crabs, frogs, kingfishers, turtles, and otters, all hiding among the palm trees, pandao shrubs, and many more that create a lush, fertile environment. Number 5. Caledonian Canal, Scotland. Connecting the east coast at Inverness with the west coast at the village of Corpash across a 60-mile stretch, the Caledonian Canal is only actually one-third man-made, with the rest of the route being made up of Loch Dochfor, Loch Ness, Loch Oich, and Loch Lochy. It was first proposed during the 18th century to provide an alternative to what at times could be quite a treacherous coastal voyage, and while many ideas of how to complete it had been put forward, it was only after 2 years of extreme drought and crop failure towards the end of the century that forced action. The fear was that the people would start moving away from Scotland, and as well as providing a shipping route for the transport of goods to communities along the way, the canal would also provide an extra source of water that could be used to reliably irrigate cropland. With Thomas Telford named as the head engineer, the canal was completed by 1822 and transformed the fortunes of those that it served. It wasn't exactly well built at first, though, and had to be closed in 1843 when one of the locks collapsed. This time was used to strengthen all of the remaining locks, and also to increase the canal's depth to 18 feet. But once it reopened, it failed to become a commercial success. It did, however, pass through some of Scotland's most incredible scenery, and it soon became a popular tourist route. Now designated as a scheduled ancient monument with more than 500,000 visitors each year, either hiring boats, staying on barges, or cycling along the towpaths, it's now one of the finest leisure canals anywhere in the world. Number 4. Göta Canal, Stockholm, Sweden. Making up a part of the waterway that traverses the Swedish countryside to provide a link between Gothenburg on the west coast and Skoterkoping on the coast of the Baltic Sea was the Göta Canal that was first opened in 1832. Itself, it's 120 miles long and was the greatest engineering project ever undertaken in the country at that time. It took 58,000 workers almost 22 years to complete, with experts and equipment brought in from England and Scotland to help with the endeavor. Almost half of it was either blasted or hand-dug, and at first it was seen as a major success. Just 23 years after the first boats used it, however, railways began opening up around Sweden, and commercial interest in the canal vanished. By the time the 1870s began, there were only 3 main types of goods that were still being transported by the canal: forest products, coal, and ore, all of which were expensive to take by train because of the weight, and didn't need to be delivered as quickly. Another problem with the canal was that because of the climate in Sweden, it's completely unusable for 5 months of the year when large parts of the water would freeze up. With 58 locks and able to accommodate vessels that measure up to 98 feet long and 23 feet wide, it's now used solely for recreational purposes. Almost 2 million people travel by boat along the canal each year, where locally it's known as the divorce ditch because of the many arguments that happen as couples try to navigate the sometimes narrow channel and use the aging locks by themselves. Number 3. The Grand Canal, China. When you think of huge engineering accomplishments in China, the first thing that comes to mind is the Great Wall. In many ways, the Grand Canal is far more impressive, though, because it required a huge amount of creative engineering and dedication to make it a reality. Known as the Zhonghang Grand Canal, it holds the record of being the longest artificial waterway on Earth. Its route starts in Beijing and travels through Tianjin and 4 provinces to the city of Zhejiang, essentially connecting the Yellow River and the Yangtze River. It wasn't all part of one project, though, and amazingly, some of the sections of the canal can be dated back more than 2,500 years. It was during the Sui dynasty between the year 581 and 618 that efforts were made to join the different sections together, and over the next 1,000 years, further parts were built. Many sections were restored, and because it provided an easily navigable route between North and South China, it's credited with helping reunify the 2 parts of the country. At more than 1,100 miles long, the canal is still relied upon, until relatively recently, for transporting huge quantities of goods between the locations that it passes through. While it's not so important for this anymore, it's undergoing a series of improvements that will make it part of the North-South Water Transfer Project, which is a huge national development in China aiming to bring water to new regions that will vastly increase agricultural opportunities. Number 2. Dubai Water Canal, Dubai, United Arab Emirates. Most canals are old structures from before the time of railways and automobiles, but the Dubai Water Canal was only opened in 2016, covering a 2-mile stretch between Business Bay and the Persian Gulf to the coastal residential resort Jumeirah. It was constructed purely for leisure purposes, in line with the Gulf state's aim of increasing its tourism industry. It ranges from between 260 and 390 feet wide and remains a consistent 20 feet deep. In many ways, it's what's built alongside the canal that's far more interesting than the waterway itself, as there's a huge trade center where it starts, along with 860,000 square feet of marinas for privately owned boats. The development that's taken place by the canal is extraordinary, and it now boasts a large shopping center, 4 hotels, 450 restaurants, a number of residential properties, and walkways and cycle paths to encourage the locals to have healthier lifestyles. It's the perfect example of how canal construction can still be relevant and worthwhile in the modern age, and hopefully will inspire others to be built elsewhere around the world. Number 1. Erie Canal, New York, United States. Officials had first proposed the idea of building a waterway between the Hudson River and the Great Lakes in the 1780s, but the sheer cost of what was being suggested was a tough sell at the time. Things changed over the following decades, though, and by 1825 the Erie Canal had been completed. At the time, it was 363 miles long, which made it the second longest canal in the world, and it was seen as a landmark example of the engineering capabilities of the United States. Often described as the nation's first superhighway, the canal at its peak saw 33,000 commercial shipments pass through it in a single year. Unlike many other canals, Erie actually managed to remain competitive with the railroads until around 1902, and it was only really with the increase in trucking and the opening of the St. Lawrence Seaway that really saw traffic numbers drop in Erie in the mid-20th century. The last surviving scheduled hauler, the Day Peckinpah, completed its last service in 1994, and Erie is now used by recreational watercraft. As a part of the Great Loop, it's connected to routes across Canada and the eastern seaboard, and also connects the other 3 canals in the New York network. It's a highly important historical monument in its own right too, and along its route, you'll find a number of parks and museums dedicated to its memory and those who were involved in building it. I'll see you next time.
Watch our Waves playlist for more top 15 videos about massive waves. Sit back, relax, and binge watch all of our best wave videos.